On today's class. Today we're going to wrap up our look at attention. So we began attention last class, introduced the idea of not being able to process all the information that is coming in, the idea of the need to select which stimuli you will process, and then also the idea of serial and parallel processors. Serial processors take in one piece of information at a time. Parallel processors can process multiple streams of information at the same time. So we're going to wrap up our look at attention today, but before we get to that, a couple of things. First off, we got exam number 1 coming up. So our first exam is going to be a week from today, so Tuesday, January 29th. It's going to happen in class, and it's going to cover the chapters and the following lectures in Cog Lab. So in terms of chapters, it's going to cover Chapter 1, the Intro to Cognitive Psychology, Chapter 4, which is our attention chapter, Chapter 7, which we didn't cover in class, but that is the, well, not all of Chapter 7, sorry, Section 7.4 A to F. That's a section on what cognitive psychology has informed us is the best way to study. So I always found it weird that oftentimes gets sprung on students halfway through the semester when we reach Chapter 7. So this is your way of kind of getting there ahead of time. So it is required readings. We're not covering it in class. It's pretty straightforward, but it will be on the exam. In terms of lectures, basically everything since the second meeting to until today. So that first intro to the course, that's not going to be on the exam. But our Chapter 1 lecture, Representation and Artificial Intelligence, and then our two Chapter 4 classes, last class and today's class, will appear on the exam. Now, we do have a class next time that is on perception. That is just so that you have a week after we finish talking about attention to prepare for the first exam instead of just 48 hours. So we're going to keep moving on. We have, we have to keep going on in cognitive psychology. But just to be clear, next class on perception will be on exam 2. So what we finish today will be what is on exam 1. So just bear that in mind. Keep that in mind when you're preparing. In terms of Cog Labs, today we're going to go over change detection and spatial cueing. So they will also appear on the exam as well. All right, so that's what the content is going to be. The format for the exam is going to be multiple choice. For those of you who have had one of my classes before, this will be familiar to you. For those of you that haven't, I have 2 sections to all of my exams. So section number 1, that's a section where we test you on material from the readings that was not covered in class, whereas section number 2, we cover material from the readings that are covered in class, material specifically only in the lectures, such as representation and AI, and the Cog Labs, because we're going to go over those in class as well. We do this because in the material that you need to read, there's just too much to cover in a single semester, but it's things and concepts and ideas that you should be aware after taking an intro to cognitive psychology class. So because of that, and because they're assigned readings, section number 1 is your way of basically being, again, rewarded for doing those readings, for learning that material, for preparing yourself for class. But we do realize that we don't cover it in class. So what I do for the topics in class, I choose the ones that are the most important, the most crucial to have an understanding of cognitive psychology, and also sometimes the ones that I identify as being a little bit more challenging that we need to spend time on in class. So that is reflected in the weights for the different sections. So section number 1 is only worth 1/3 of your exam score. Section number 2 is worth 2/3 of your exam score. Now, they're not going to necessarily have that distribution of points. They're just differently weighted. So bear that in mind when you're doing the exam. Section number 1 is only worth 1/3. Section 2 is worth 2/3. And in section number 1, it's going to be about readings, again, that we haven't covered in class. And I do not expect you to have as thorough and as deep an understanding of that material. So section number 1 will be recognition type questions only. And these are those sort of definitional type questions where if you've read it in the chapter and you recall that information, you'll be able to answer that particular question. So it doesn't require deep understanding. It would say something like, if we were doing it on, for example, attention, it would say something like a serial processor is a processor that processes A, one piece of information at a time, B, multiple pieces of information at a time, C, other options. And as long as you remember what a serial processor is, you will be able to answer that question. So section number 1, recognition type only questions. Section number 2 will include recognition type questions as well, but it can also include more questions that test your understanding a little bit deeper. So for example, application type questions will be included in section 2. So, if I ask a question like, Jim was doing a psychology experiment, and when, he had to find a target, and when there was only 3 distractors, he found the target very quickly. When there were 100 distractors, he found a target very slowly. Jim was using a serial processor, a parallel processor, some other type of processor. And for that, you actually have to have a deeper understanding of what those processors are like. You have to be able to apply your knowledge and realize that the distractors, as they increased, the reaction time also increased, indicating that Jim was doing a serial processing task where you had to check each and every one of those distractors to find the target. So those types of application questions will appear in section 2 as well, and it will be worth 2/3 of your score. All right, any questions on the upcoming exam? It's going to be the only thing we do that class.
Are you going to have any extra credit?
For the exams?
Yeah.
Yes, and that is the professional development. So the professional development that you're doing, that is going to earn you extra credit towards each exam. Any other questions about exam number 1?
What day did you say it was? Because January 25th is a Friday.
Oh, shoot, I didn't get that updated. I missed one. 29. It's a week from today.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we only ever, it's Tuesday or Thursday. I think I missed one. Thanks for pointing that out. Any other questions? All right, so in a week we'll have exam number 1. And as was mentioned, you do have an opportunity to earn extra credit toward exam number 1. Before we get to the social media professional development assignment number 3, I just want to point out that the mastery practice that is available to you through the through that online through your online e-text, those are due midnight before the exam to complete your mastery trials. So be sure that you continue to work on those. Remember, you cannot group those all together in one binge session. They are forcibly separated by intervals by the program. So just make sure that you've been working on those and completing those, because they will be highly beneficial to help you remember and recall and learn that information. All right, so on to social media professional development assignment number 3. So now that you have established an account, now that you've started following other professional psychologists, you're getting plugged into that community, it's time to start thinking about one of the big benefits of actually having a social media presence. And one of the big things is what I like to call the big ask. So eventually, not right now, but eventually, you will be able to turn to your network and ask them to contribute some information, to contribute some assistance towards whatever goal you are trying to accomplish. So an example of that was one that I just saw. This is from last week. So Randy McCarthy, he goes, academic friends, what is the best writing advice for undergraduates who will be writing their first APA-style manuscript this semester? I would like to give them tips and tricks from the pros, i.e. you, please and thank you. So he is asking his network of contacts to basically do work for him, right? So he's basically saying, oh, I'm teaching an undergraduate class where they're going to be writing their first APA-style paper, and rather than me doing a ton of research on Google and reading through and trying to identify the best practices, why don't I just crowdsource this and say, you guys who have had this experience, what have you found are the best practices? So he's basically asking them to contribute information to him for his goal there. So that's one of the best uses of having a social media account, is that ability to go out there and say, hey, what's the best way to do this? Or, what kind of advice do you have for this? Or, I'm promoting this event, please share. Or, I'm trying to get into, this graduate program. Who has had a good experience and in which university? So these are all things that you can ask your network. But one of the key things to remember, and that's what we're going to be working on right now, because you're not going to be asking yet, one of the key things to remember is that you should give before you take. So, what we're going to do now is try to establish relationships. We're going to try to establish you as a contributor first. So you're going to be giving before you ever do a big ask, and we're actually not even going to do that this semester. We're just kind of setting it up for you in the future. But what we're going to do this semester is we're going to start giving back to the people that we're following. And one of the ways to do that, and one of the ways that Randy has done that, is to make a contribution to their work. So do something for them before you ask them to do something for yourself. And one of the easiest ways to do that, and most straightforward ways to do that, and ways that you can contribute right now, is simply to share their information with other people. So by simply retweeting, you can basically start contributing to their work. So we know that you're undergrads. You're not going to read their paper and come up with a scathing critique that helps them move on to the next stage in their research, probably. But we definitely can get their message out and help them spread, the message that they have. So, for example, when I read Randy McCarthy's tweet, I shared it with my followers, and I said there's some great advice in this thread, and I retweeted it. And that was a way of, however small, making that contribution so you can develop that giving before you do the taking. All right, so that's what we're going to do this week. It's going to be rather simple. So at any point during this week, I would like you to just retweet 2 tweets from any of the psychologists that you're following. So you should be following about 7 psychologists now, myself included. Let's make sure that we're getting out there. So don't retweet me, even though my tweets are awesome. Don't feel the need. Choose somebody else, but retweet from any of the psychologists that you're following. And what we're going to do is we're going to do it twice this week. I'm not going to have you hand in anything for this, but what I am going to do is I'm going to track this involvement with the following hashtags. So for the first retweet, use the hashtag IUSB FuturePsych01. And then for the second, use the hashtag IUSB FuturePsych02. So again, just sometime during this week, check your feed. Some of your professional psychologists will be tweeting information. If you see something that you find interesting, if you see something that you think might be beneficial, retweet it. No need to comment. They have the option retweet or retweet with a comment. Either or is fine, but definitely make sure that you include the hashtag IUSB FuturePsych01 for your first, 02 for your second, so that I can track that involvement. And that is going to be due Monday, January 28th. I did that right? Yeah. Monday, January 28th by midnight. Any questions on part 3? All right. All right, so we're going to now continue with attention. So the part that we didn't get to last time, where does attention come from? We're going to see that there's 2 major sources of attention. One is stimulus-driven. The other one is goal-driven attention. And then we're going to take a look at change detection, Cog Lab number 1. We're going to see what the results of that Cog Lab are and what implications they have for attention. And then we're going to take a look at Cog Lab number 2 and again see the results, see the implications, and that will be it for today. So where does this attention come from? Why is it that we attend to certain things and we don't attend to other things? Why is it that we focus on some information but we don't focus on other information? Well, attention selects the information that it's going to process, but how is this selection actually made? So in order for attention to occur, you have to select some information for processing and ignore other information. But how is this selection made? Well, it turns out that there's two major ways that this selection is made, and both of them are very nicely illustrated in this clip from The Matrix. So if you haven't seen The Matrix, I mentioned it before. It's a movie from the 1900s about a future world. I won't spoil it for you. Definitely go see it. Massively imbued with cognitive psychology ideas, including this one, where Neo is following Morpheus around inside the Matrix. As an aside, the Matrix is also probably a prequel to John Wick, so be prepared.
The Matrix is a system, Neo. That system is our enemy. When you're inside, you look around, what do you see? Businessmen, teachers, lawyers, carpenters, the very minds of the people we are trying to save. But until we do, these people are still a part of that system, and that makes them our enemy. You have to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system, that they will fight to protect it. Were you listening to me, Neo? Or were you looking at the woman in the red dress? I was, yeah. Was it?
All right, so two examples of where stimulus comes from in that one scene, and they both have to do with the woman in the red dress. So where does our attention come from? Well, one source of attention comes from what's known as stimulus-driven attention. That is, there is something in the environment, and the characteristics of the stimulus alone draw your attention towards it. So things that grab our attention, stimuli that grab our attention, things like color will grab our attention, things like uniqueness will grab our attention, things like motion will grab our attention. And this all falls under stimulus-driven attention, and this is known as exogenous control. So exogenous control comes from the base words exo, meaning outside, genus, meaning generated. So this is literally attention that is generated by the outside. It's attention that is generated by your environment. So when Neo was walking through this crowded city street, there was way too much information to process. There was tons of people just walking by him, and you could see he was looking around, way too much information to process. But then all of a sudden, the woman in the red dress comes along, and his attention was just grabbed. And he followed her along, and that's an example of stimulus-driven attention, that exogenous control. So this is, again, where the stimulus itself grabs your attention. Attention is driven by the stimulus. The source of the attention is actually the stimulus in the environment. That was the first category of attention illustrated in this clip. The second category is goal-directed attention. So later in the clip, Morpheus tells Neo, he asks him, he goes, were you paying attention to me, or were you looking at the woman in the red dress? And Neo kind of stammers, and then Morpheus goes, look again. And that look again was another source of attention, and that was goal-directed attention. So with that look again, Neo's goal now was to refocus on that woman in the red dress. Unfortunately for him, it turned into one of the agents. But regardless, he was focusing on that stimulus. That's goal-directed attention, and that's known as endogenous control. So endo meaning inside, genus once again meaning generated. So this is attention that is generated from our inside, our mind. And it's where we specifically move our attention. So the attention isn't grabbed by an outside force. We specifically say, I'm going to attend on this because this is my goal. I'm going to process this information because this is my goal. And it's that attention driven by our goals idea that is the second source of attention. All right, so any questions about exogenous or endogenous control? Mm-hmm.
So would you say that exogenous control could be like bottom-up processing, and then endogenous control could be top-down processing?
Yes, okay. I would say very much so. Mm-hmm. So endogenous control comes from our inner goals, comes from our minds. That's top-down processing. We have high-level goals, and we influence our lower-level processes like attention. Exogenous control is a bottom-up process. It comes from the stimuli. It comes from more basic procedures. So yeah, that's a good observation. Any other questions? All right. So let's take a look at change detection, the first Cog Lab that you completed. So in this one, two pictures were presented in alteration. They went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And your task was just to detect if a change occurred in the pictures. So 50% of the pictures were identical, 50% were different, where there was some change. So once again, in half of the pictures, there was no change. In half of the pictures, there was a change. And your task was simply to identify, yes, there is a change in this picture. No, there is not a change in this picture. There were two conditions. There was a no flicker condition and what's known as a flicker condition. And in the no flicker condition, the pictures appeared immediately after another. So you had picture number one, picture number two, picture number one, picture number two, picture number one, picture number two. In the flicker condition, however, there was blank gray boxes that appeared between the pictures. So it would be picture number one, gray boxes, picture number two, gray boxes, picture number one, gray boxes, picture number two. And the question was, in which of these conditions would you be more accurate? Or would you be more quick to notice the change, to detect that difference, or to decide that there was no difference? All right, so in the flicker condition, kind of looked like this. So you would have your image here. Gray boxes would pop up. There's your second image there. And you have to determine, is there a change or is there no change? And is there a change or is there no change? I believe this one is no change. So let's take a look at another one. Once again, in the gray box condition. So is there a change or no change?
Change.
All right, and what's changing? The light. Okay. So in this one, there is a change. The light right there changes. And notice that it's not an insubstantial change. It's not something that is a little, small little pixel change to detect. It's something rather large. It's something rather prominent. It's something, right basically in the center of the image. So the question again is, how fast were you at detecting this change or deciding that there was no change? So that was the flicker condition. In the no flicker condition, hopefully you experienced that it was much easier to realize that there's a change. So this is an example of a no flicker condition. So once again, readily apparent that there is a change. That girl is disappearing and reappearing. And then in this one here, as they change, and you can see the change in the, goes from a red background to a blue background here to indicate that the two pictures are changing, it is very evident very quickly that there is no change. These are absolutely identical pictures. All right, so let's take a look at the results that came about from this experiment. So here we have the proportion correct. So this is how many times did you identify the no change condition? How many times did you identify the change condition and the no change condition correctly? So either saying yes, there is a change, or saying no, there is not a change. And how many times did you identify in the no flicker condition, change versus no change? So this is the flicker condition here. This is the no flicker condition here. Higher bars indicate higher proportion correct, all the way from 0, you got it wrong every single time. 50% here would be chance performance. So if you were just guessing, you had a 50-50 shot in every trial of guessing correctly. So if you were just pressing change, no change, change, no change, blindfolded, if you were doing like a Cog Lab bird box challenge or something, you would still get 50%. So that's chance right there. And then this would be perfect performance up there. And as you can see, you have less percent correct or proportion correct in the flicker condition than in the no flicker condition here. So more accurate in the no flicker condition than you are in the flicker condition. So much easier to detect a change in the no flicker condition than there is in the flicker condition. Much easier to detect a change when the pictures come one after another than when the pictures have that gray box put in between. So this is proportion correct. They also reported reaction times, so how quickly were you able to detect that change, how quickly we were able to decide that there was a change or there was not a change. And here we have, once again, the flicker condition, no flicker condition. This is reaction time in milliseconds. So each 1,000 of these is a second. So this is 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 6 seconds. And you can see that in the flicker condition, on average, it took about 12 seconds before you were able to determine, oh, it's the lamp that's changing, or oh, it's the, airplane engine that is changing. So it took a long time in the flicker condition, but notice you are much quicker, 4 seconds quicker in the no flicker condition to indicate that there is a change or no change. And just to kind of give you some context, in cognitive psychology experiments, 4 seconds is like a lifetime, right? Most of our cognitive decisions come down to milliseconds. We'll see that often where there's like a 100 millisecond difference, there's like a 50 millisecond difference, indicating differential processing. So this difference here is absolutely massive. We are faster in the no flicker condition. So not only are we faster in the no flicker condition, but we are also more accurate in the no flicker condition, indicating that there is no speed accuracy trade-off. We are just massively better in that no flicker condition than we are in the flicker condition. All right, any questions on the results that occurred? Did anybody take a look at their results and get different results? Mm-hmm.
For the first one, mine were the same, like the flicker and the flicker.
So you were equally accurate for the flicker and the no flickering condition? And what about for the second one?
I don't remember the second one.
You don't remember the second one? So that's a good indication of why oftentimes in reaction time research or in proportion correct research, they will also measure reaction time. Because one of the ways that you could, well, what do you think? What is a strategy that you could use in order to get equal proportion correct across this task?
You could just take a whole lot longer in the flicker condition to make sure every single thing was the same before you make a decision.
Exactly. So if you were to take a lot longer in both conditions, then you would have a very high proportion correct in each of those conditions. So that would indicate that would be part of the, that would indicate that maybe we're just as good in the flicker and the no flicker condition until you take a look at the reaction times. And if you take a look at your reaction times, you're probably still faster in the no flicker condition. Once again, indicating that maybe the accuracy is the same, but we're much quicker to get that no flicker condition decision versus the flicker condition, versus that gray box condition. All right, any other observations, comments? All right. So let's take a look at what this all means. So we are clearly not very good at detecting change in certain conditions. So what are some of the ideas in terms of why we are so bad at detecting change? And if you ever take a look at examples of change detection, you will notice that the amount of change in some of these instances is just massive. And you'll recall that in the moonwalking bear, and especially in the whodunit example with the inspector trying to figure out who murdered Lord Smythe, there was massive change all around, and we as a group missed most of it. So what are some of the possibilities about why we are so bad at detecting change? Mm-hmm.
We don't know where to look, or like where to focus.
Yeah, so part of the reason is that we oftentimes don't know where to focus. Oftentimes we are not focusing in the right place. So if we don't know where to focus, then we won't process the correct information and we won't notice different changes. We won't put our attention to different, to what we should put our attention on. And oftentimes this comes up, for example, in eyewitness testimony. They have what's known as gun focus. There's an effect in eyewitness testimony that's known as gun focus. And what that is that when witnesses were threatened with a weapon, for example, a gun, they tend to focus on the gun. So that when the police ask them what did the perpetrator look like, oftentimes they find that they can't remember at all what this person looks like. They could tell them a lot about the gun, but not about what the face looked like because they put all their processing power on that very important stimulus and nothing else on, and didn't have any processing power on the rest of the face. Any other ideas? Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess that we probably just assume that most things are going to stay the same because it would take up too much cognitive space to just focus on everything all the time and make sure nothing's changing.
Mm-hmm. So this is another great point, and this kind of feeds into the example also of in these cases we're not focusing on the right things as well, and it's an automatic process. And one of the things to remember as we go through this semester is that our cognitive systems developed to live in this world. Our cognitive systems developed to process the information that comes from this particular world, and it takes advantage of consistencies in this particular world. So one of the things that is oftentimes consistent is that our world very often does not change. So I can turn away from all of you as many times as I want, and the chairs are pretty much going to be there, the desks are pretty much going to be there, that wall is going to be there, that clock is going to stay there, the projector is going to stay there. Most of your world stays the same. And this is a nice indication that we, again, that idea of our brains are as smart as they need to be and as stupid as, our minds are as smart as they need to be and as stupid as they can be. We use the outside world oftentimes as a representation. So when AI first started trying to develop general intelligence, when they started to try to develop robots that could navigate, for example, an environment, oftentimes what they started with representing the environment. So they would, in the robot's mind, program a representation that said where everything was, and then they would use that to try to navigate the robot around the area to pick up cans. So one robot was made to pick up aluminum cans, in an office, and they tried to do it by programming where everything is in the office. That required massive amounts of memory, massive amounts of processing power, and it failed. It just wasn't effective. However, when they let the outside environment stand in for itself, when it was its own representation, all of a sudden they found that if they just put in a few basic rules about how to navigate in the environment, the robot would be able to just go around this office, not bump into things, and it was able to retrieve cans and eventually put it into the garbage without ever having a representation of the outside world inside its mind. So one of the things that often occurs in cognitive psychology is because we're so very good at what we do, it's very effortless for us. So for us to navigate a room is effortless. For us to recognize a face is usually effortless. And because of that, we oftentimes believe it's a rather straightforward process. Things like this, change detection, where it's a very simple task and we realize that, let's face it, we suck at it, just kind of shows and illustrates the limits of where our cognition is. So one of the reasons that we don't detect change is because we don't have that internal representation in our mind of what the outside world is. And one of the reasons we don't have that internal representation is because it would just take up too much processing power in our mind. And we don't need it because we have a representation of the world. It's out there in the world. So if I ever want to know what does this room look like, I can just take a look at this room. And I don't need to worry about detecting change in this room because usually there's not going to be very much change in this room. And if there is change, it's going to grab my attention because usually change occurs in the environment in a very specific way. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. Actually, we'll get to it right now. So why are you better, more accurate, and faster in that no flicker condition? Why is it that when those two images are alternated one after another with no gray box in between, why is it, do you think, that we're faster at detecting those changes?
Movement. It made it look like movement without the box in between. So I mean, I was able to recognize it because it looked like part of the picture was moving. But with the gray box, it was a delay. So I see the gray box and then I see the movement. So it's like an extra step.
Exactly. So that is one of the best theories about why we're so good in the no flicker condition. Is because it is triggering our movement processors. So when you think about movement, most of the time what movement is, especially when it grabs your attention, is just the presence of something and then the absence of that same thing. Presence of something, absence of that same thing. So when your friends are trying to get your attention and they're in a crowd, they will wave at you. And what happens is that hand appears in your field of vision and then out of your field of vision, and then in your field of vision and then out of your field of vision. And you perceive that as motion, and you immediately just kind of look and go, oh, there they are. Those are where my friends are. So in the no flicker condition, that immediate change between the two pictures triggers our motion processing systems, triggers our motion detectors. And that is something that we dedicate a lot of processing power towards, because in our environment, motion is very, very important. So whenever any of you move, it grabs my attention. So when people readjust, when people grab a pencil or something, when people put up their hand, it grabs my attention. That clock is not really moving. It does not grab my attention. That projector is not moving. Does not grab my attention. So again, we spend a lot of processing power processing the things that are important to us. And in our cognitive history, in our cognitive evolution, motion was very, very important to us because the things that moved in the environment could eat you and be very important to your survival, or you could eat them and they were very important to your survival, for example. So being able to process motion and dedicating a lot of resources to that is one of the reasons why we're much more accurate and faster in that no flicker condition. All right, so what type of attention then is driving this effect? Is the ability to recognize motion? We'll start off with the flicker condition. So is the ability to recognize change in the flicker condition, the one that we're really fast at, would you say that that's endogenous attention control coming from within, or is that exogenous control coming from without? What was that? Exogenous. So in the flicker condition, it's exogenous control. There's just something about that change that grabs your attention, and that's why you're very quick at noticing what the change was. And again, the idea is that is activating your motion processors, and that stimulus itself is driving that effect. What about in the flicker condition? When you are able to detect the change in the flicker condition, is that exogenous control of your attention, or is it endogenous control? Endogenous control. Exactly. So most of you probably realize that when you were looking for that change in the flicker condition, you had to enact some sort of strategy. You had to drive yourself to say, all right, is it the boat? No, it's not the boat. Is it this person? No, it's not this person. Is it this dog? No, it's not this dog. Is it this cloud? No, it's not this cloud. Is it this light? Yes, it is. So nothing in those conditions, in the flicker condition, was grabbing your attention, was drawing you towards processing that stimulus. It was all from within. You had a task. You had to detect if there was a change. You had that goal, and that's why you chose to attend to different aspects of the picture to get that endogenous processing, that goal-driven, from within processing of the stimuli. All right, any questions about any of that before we take a look at an application to the real world? All right, so let's take it out of the laboratory context. We'll put it back into the real world. Just again to kind of show you how bad our attention can actually be. All right, so let's take a look here.
Most of us think we're pretty observant, but with a bit of mind control, I wanted to see if I could make these people take even the most obvious things for granted.
Excuse me, can I get to Trinity Church from here? Yeah. You see that church down there?
Yep, straight through there.
All right, so just we'll see how extreme this can get. But once again, notice that this doesn't normally happen, right? When you're talking to somebody and you look away and you come back, typically it's the same person. And our minds have picked up on that. Our minds have picked up on that idea that people don't spontaneously change. So the idea is that why would we bother to process deeply the identity of somebody that we're talking to? Because if we need to know what their identity is, we can just take a look at them, right? If we need to know, oh, do they have blonde hair? We can just be like, yes or no, right? We can just take a look at them. So it seems massively surprising and counterintuitive that this switch would not be noticed. But again, it just shows you that our minds are not necessarily smart. They're as dumb as they can be to accomplish the tasks that we need to in our environment.
And then you walk down 2 or 3 blocks and Trinity Church is over there. You're walking in that direction.
Excuse me, you're at Trinity Church, is it?
Might be the wall Stephen by the way.
Okay. We're down here somewhere, aren't we?
Yeah. See, I need to.
Sorry.
I love that it's a picture of him.
It's like the Trinity Church. If you keep going that way, you're like wobbling and you're
That seemed almost too easy. So later on, I see how far I can take it.
Well, we'll see. We'll see if they
You
are.
know where Trinity Church is?
Okay. Last time I switched with someone who looked a little bit like me, but where's the fun in that?
You know who's best to like you? The other side, see what that lady's standing?
Sure.
That's the pool. No, the lady in the braid.
the other side.
Yeah, the other side.
But so you don't know where it is.
Exactly what street, no, but in that direction.
Okay.
Yeah, okay?
Yeah, do you know where Trinity Church is? From there.
Yeah, fine. Come on, I'll take you. Oh, you want to walk now?
I'm gonna catch some other people. Sorry, guys.
Okay, once you go on Broadway,
Yes.
come on, the numbers are going. Get rid of the Broadway, going down.
Yes.
Walk up straight
that
that
way.
way and just walk straight down. You're gonna see it. It's really brown.
That's brilliant. Thanks for your help.
Alright, but don't worry about it.
All right, so we'll take a moment and talk about this guy here. So one of the comments was that, well, maybe these people are noticing that there's a difference, but they just don't want to say anything. They also want to be like, hey, I wasn't talking to you. You know, something weird happened here. And this guy here is a nice indication that, at least for the first couple of examples, that wasn't the case. Because if you take a look at their faces, there was no sort of like, you know, surprise, like, whoa, what's going on here? So even though they might not have wanted to say anything, it's clear by their expressions that they did not notice, you know, any of the changes. This one here, though, is a very interesting case because he's the only one that noticed that the person so far had changed. Now, what are some of the? Does anybody have any ideas why he might have noticed that change? What was different about his particular interaction?
He asked him if he wanted to walk with him, so he actually made like conversation and I think even eye contact.
Okay, so he asked if you wanted to walk with him. He actually made eye contact and conversation. Anything else with this individual yet?
Could also be that the other people were older, because he looks a little younger than the others.
Okay, it could be age differences played a part as well. So that's two possibilities here.
It looked like this guy was paying more attention to him than the other people were just like, oh yeah, it's over there. But this guy was like, hey man, like let's walk over there.
So in both of those first two possibilities, basically it boils down to, for whatever reason, this individual here paid more attention to the guy's facial features. For whatever reason, he dedicated more processing power, more processing resources to figuring out what this person's face is. Now, two of the things that were kind of brought up. Number one, we'll talk about the age-related differences. One thing that they found in these types of experiments, and you can check them out online. There's hundreds of these examples that use this basic, moving a picture or a door in between you and the person that you're speaking to. What they found is that the more similar the person is to you, the more likely you were to notice a change. So if you're a young student and you're here on campus and you get asked by another student, directions somewhere, and then they make the change, you're more likely to notice that difference than if it was an older professor that was making that change. Vice versa, if a professor is being asked for the change by an older professor, they're more likely to notice a change in the individual than if a student is making the request. So one of the things that they've identified is that if you identify the person as being part of your group, you're more likely to identify the change than if they're part of the out group. And that might be an example of an exogenous processing of attention, because typically in your day-to-day life, in-group people are more important than out-group people. Now, I don't mean that they're more important kind of like on an ethical standard, but when you think about your day-to-day interactions, when you think about your day-to-day, benefiting and social kind of contracts that you make, a lot of those are with your in-groups. Your in-groups are the ones that are very crucial to your kind of success in your life. Out-group people, not so much. So the fact that you would process an in-group person more could be an example of that exogenous goal. You recognize them as an in-group. You say, all right, your mind triggers, this is important. This stimulus I'm going to process. The other possibility was, in this case, this guy, he was way friendlier than anybody else, right? So everybody else was kind of like, well, yeah, it's over there, and okay, you kind of follow here. He was the only guy where he was like, oh, do you know how to get to the church? He's like, yeah, let me take you. I'll take you. Let's go. Let's go to the church, right? So he was clearly friendly. And friendship and social interactions at that level, you can think of that as a goal, right? So if you want to be friends with somebody, if you're an outgoing, friendly person, your goal is to become friends with someone. And part of that goal includes knowing their identity, right? So part of that goal includes getting to know who that person is. So that would be an example of an endogenous attention process here, because everybody without the goal of being friendly to this individual can ignore their particular identity. But if you have the goal of being friends with an individual, then part of that is processing who they are and their identity. So that's probably the reason why he was looking at this individual so much, because it fit with his goal. And if it's goal-driven, that would be an example of an endogenous source of attention. All right, so let's see a few more examples and see how wild this gets.
You know Trinity Churches? Ah, sorry. Well, where are we here? Sort of there.
Right here.
Go on.
Where you work on bridge. You want to cross over there? Sit down in front of me. Okay. Thank you.
All right, so we'll stop it there. It's pretty much more of the same. But again, this is an indication, and this is why a lot of the work that we do here in cognitive psychology is so important. This is an indication of the limits of our attention, the limits of our perceptual ability. And when change detection came out, people were astounded that this was even possible, right? People were astounded that you could change the gender and race of an individual and you would still not realize that the person had actually changed. So this just kind of showed and turned kind of perception and attention on its head, because before that, we thought that we processed a lot more of the information because we were so able to interact with our environment. But when we put it into this specialized situation of change detection, we realized that we process very little of our environment. And again, the reason that we don't process the environment very much is because if we ever need to know what the environment looks like, we can just take a look at the environment, right? So we don't have to dedicate all these mental processes and mental resources to coding, you know, this is a Caucasian male with hair in a black coat, because we just know that if we need any of that information, we can just look at the person that we're interacting with. When you put your mind into an artificial situation like this, it then really starts to show the breakdowns and the limits of our abilities and allows us as psychologists to understand more fully what our minds are actually doing. So while it is sort of unbelievable, and it is, it's unbelievable that these changes were not detected, these errors really led to a leap in terms of our understanding of how our attention actually works. All right, any final comments or ideas about change detection? All right, so let's move on to the second Cog Lab that we did for attention, which is the spatial cueing Cog Lab. So in this case, there was 3 conditions. There was a neutral condition, a valid condition, and an invalid condition. And you basically needed to find a target as quickly as you can. And in the neutral condition, there was no arrow indicating where the target might be, right? So in the neutral condition, you were left on your own to your own devices. In the valid condition, there was an arrow. In the invalid conditions, there was also an arrow. And what differentiated them was that in the valid condition, the stimulus actually appeared where the arrow pointed. So in the valid condition, the arrow was a truthful piece of information. It was a correct piece of information. It told you where the target was going to be. In the invalid conditions, the arrow did the exact opposite. The arrow pointed one way, the target appeared on the other location. So in the invalid condition, the arrow was basically lying to you and sending you in the wrong direction. So your task was to respond to the appearance of a red square as quickly as possible. That was your task for this. That was your the target that you have to find. And it would either appear to the left or to the right of a fixation point. So you are focusing on a center point, target would appear to the left or the right, and you tried to keep your attention focused on the center, and you would indicate as quickly as possible when you found that particular target. Just to make sure that you didn't completely ignore the arrow, the valid condition occurred about 80% of the time. The invalid condition only occurred about 20% of the time. So as a strategy, overall, it was beneficial for you to listen to the arrow, right? So if you ignored the arrow, that wouldn't be beneficial because most of the time, the arrow was being truthful, sending you to the right location. All right, so that's the situation. What happened in the neutral condition? Well, this was basically the neutral condition. You would see your fixation point. There would be no arrow one way or the other. A square would pop up, and you would just have to click detect it when you decided is it to the left or is it to the right. In the valid condition, you would have your fixation point. An arrow would indicate that your target is going to be, in this case, to the left. You were again asked to maintain fixation on that center target, and in this case, on that center fixation or arrow, and in this case, the target would appear where the arrow indicated. And then finally, in the invalid condition, same thing, you fixate on the center. When the arrow comes, you don't move your eyes to the other location, you stay fixated. and then we have a target, but this time it pops up in the wrong area. So the question is, in this case here, how long is it going to take you to click detect it when the arrow lied to you and sent you into the wrong location? All right, so what happened? What are the results? So here we have the results. We have reaction time here on the y-axis, and here down on the x-axis we got the conditions. We got neutral, valid, and the invalid conditions. And the neutral here, you can kind of think of it as a control condition. This is basically how fast you are when you're left to your own devices. And we can see that we are faster in the valid condition than we are in the neutral condition. So that information that the target is going to appear to one side or the other, even though we're staring at the center location, even though we're not moving our eyes from the center location, we are still able to respond faster to that target in that valid condition. However, when we're lied to in the invalid condition, we take longer than in either other condition, especially compared to the valid, but importantly compared to the neutral or control condition. So when that target lies to us, we are slower in that invalid condition when it sends us to the wrong location. All right, so any questions about the results? All right. So why are we faster in the valid condition and slower in the invalid condition, i.e. what was moving to that cued location? So any ideas on that? So it wasn't your eyes that were moving, but what was moving?
It's like covert attention, so like your peripheral vision.
Yes, so it was your covert attention. So in those valid and invalid conditions, your covert attention was being moved to wherever the arrow indicated. So again, you were staring at the fixation point or at the arrow, but your attention was moving to the side. So it's like you were using your peripherals. It's like when you're at a social event, you know, and your friend is like, oh, look who just walked in. And they're like, don't look. And you're like, okay. And they're like, do you see them? And you're like, yeah, I do. It's like, oh my gosh, can you believe they showed up? And you're like, no, I can't believe they did. And you're like staring at your friend, but you're attending, right, to your peripherals. You're attending outside of your what you're fixating on. So that's what was being moved to that cued location. It was your covert attention. And as we can see in the valid condition, you were very fast in the valid condition because even though you were focusing your eyes on this location here, your covert attention moved to this location over here. So it was there, it was ready, it was good to go, and once that red square popped up, your attention was already there. All you needed to do was to process that there was a red square there, and you could hit that detected it. So you would be very, very quick in that valid condition. On the other hand, in the invalid condition, when you saw this arrow here, once again, you still maintained your eyes on this arrow, but now your covert attention moved over here. So now when something popped up in the opposite area, not only were you not ready to go to process it, you were at the wrong location, so there was nothing here to process, but when this stimulus grabbed your attention, when it exerted that exogenous control, you then had to move your covert attention all the way back over here before you could process this and say, yes, I detected it. So that difference between the two bars indicates how long does it take your attention to move across the screen to this other location here. The difference between the valid and invalid conditions basically is an indication of how long it takes you to move your covert attention. All right, so in this case, covert attention was moving to the cued location. So what type of attention is driving this effect? Is it endogenous or is it exogenous? So let's start off with the arrow. So in this task, the arrow pointed you to a particular location. Was that exogenous control or was that endogenous control? Okay, so I heard endogenous, that's correct. So in this case, the arrow would be endogenous control because there's nothing about an arrow that drives your attention to one location outside of your understanding and your goal of following where that arrow is, right? So there's nothing about, you know, two lines with a line in the center that makes you go one way or the other. It's just that we had a goal, and that information, that arrow, pointed towards the goal more often than not. So when we moved our attention towards that goal, towards that target location, it was goal driven, it was from the inside. That would be an example of exogenous control. What about when the square popped up? Especially in the invalid condition. When that squared pop up, is that, and we started attending to it, is that mostly, let's go with that, exogenous, or would that be mostly endogenous? That would be exogenous, because that is an indication of change. It's a red square on a black background, much like the woman in the red dress walking amongst the sea of people in black outfits. That itself grabs your attention. So even if you did not have to do this task, even if this was just a video that you were watching, your eyes would and your attention would immediately go to that red square. That makes it an exogenous stimulus, and that is, again, a nice indication of the difference between the two forms of attention. And importantly, you can see that it takes effort and time to move our attention around. So it's not an instantaneous process. It takes time to physically move your attention from one location to another. It's very quick. All right. So if we take a look at those times, well, I forgot to highlight it. It was milliseconds, right? It was like hundreds of milliseconds, so it was very, very quick. But at the same time, it indicates that yes, indeed, we do need to move our attention. All right. Any applications for this? So this would not be a very important result if it did not go beyond finding red squares on black backgrounds. So can anybody think of applications of miscuing and the fact that our attention takes time to move from one area to another? All right, well, it's almost the end of the day. Oh, we got one, all right.
Well, okay, so like, you know, when you're at a stoplight and it says like turn left only when the green arrow is like a big green. So if the people that are going straight have like the green light, sometimes I'll be paying attention to that, and I'll think like if I'm in the left turning lane, I'll like, you know, press the gas a little bit and think, oh, I gotta stop. So that's just kind of maybe what I feel like it would be, or like the light changing from red to green. But I don't know if that counts.
That's a nice example. So this is again a nice example of your attention being grabbed by something else, even though you're trying to endogenously pay attention to your green turn light signal. So that is oftentimes I find myself doing the reverse of that, where no, actually this is that same thing where, you know, the people beside you are going, and that motion grabs your attention, and you're like, okay, I can go. And then you're like, oh no, wait, I can't. You know, this isn't the time. So that's a nice indication, and it takes you time to like get out of that and like put your attention back. And that sort of grabbing your attention away is one of the reasons why, for a lot of driving safety, basically everything that they tell you not to do while you're driving are things that take your covert attention, at the very least, from your driving task. So things like texting typically, unless you're an expert, takes your overt attention away as well. So typically you got to look down, you know, so don't do this. My miming, it is not an endorsement of texting while you're driving, but you have to, you know, look down and start texting, and you have to take your attention away from what is, you know, occurring. And as we saw here, when you take your attention away from something, it takes time to get it back up to that particular location. So that's one of the reasons why texting and driving is so dangerous.
What about when you're like driving and like when you're driving for a while, it's just like muscle memory, but you'll be like in your own head, like thinking about something, and you just like drive like you're like, I don't know, like I'll be like going to school and I'll drive like I'm not going to school because I'm just in my own head, and I'll be like, oh wait, I have to turn here.
Yep.
So can you get distracted by your own thoughts in your head?
That, I mean, definitely you can get distracted by your own thoughts in your own head. You know, because people can daydream and then not pay attention to where they need to go. That's another reason why conversations in cars are can be very dangerous. And what they found was that, you know, if you're on your phone, and you know nobody does this anymore, but if you're on your phone, right, and you're driving, you don't have two hands on the wheel, right? That's not the issue, because even hands-free devices, people still get more in more accidents talking on a hands-free device than they do when they're talking to somebody who's in the car. And what psychologists have found is that people who are talking to you in the car, they will monitor unconsciously their own conversations. And when you get into a situation where you need to pay a lot of attention, they will slow down their conversation. So if you get stuck in traffic, or if you need to make a left turn and you're like, you know, you need to pay attention to multiple things at the same time, they found that people will decrease their conversation, so you don't have to process as much of that information. But then when you're on a straightaway on the highway, it's like, oh, you know, whatever. People on a hands-free speaker who are on the other end, they don't know the situation. So the fact that they maintain that level of conversation is one of the reasons why those hands-free devices are not as safe, you know, as they would make them out to be. Now, your situation, though, is a little bit different. And yours is actually something that we'll come across a little bit later when we start talking about expertise. And it's the idea that as you go from a novice to an expert, many of the processing things that you do become automatic processing. And one of the stages in your life where that situation that you just talked about, where you're driving to school and then all of a sudden you're like, you don't even remember how you got there, you just kind of notice, oh, I'm in the parking lot. You know, here we are. Guaranteed that never happened when you were learning to drive. When you were first learning to drive and you're sitting there and you're like, okay, 10 to 2, brake, put it into drive, check your mirrors, you know, do this. When it wasn't automatic, you never came to school and were like, how did I get here? You were like, I know exactly how I got here, because I have to turn on my signal, I have to check, you know, there, I got to look where I want to go. So when it was conscious and when it was non-automatic processing, you were paying attention to that, so you were very aware when it occurred. As soon as it's unconscious, because now you're just so practiced, you don't need to attend to it anymore, so you can attend to other things. You can process other information. And to the extent that you are not processing where you're driving, it's almost like an example of change blindness, where all of a sudden you're like, I was at home, now I'm at school, what happened? Well, the same thing, because you just weren't paying attention to, you know, things that you didn't need to pay attention to. So it's not even that, you know, it's a dangerous thing to do. It's just that for you to accomplish that task, you don't need to focus on, you know, all the little things. All right, so let's end today with one application. So one of the applications of this, so we already saw a few. Another application of this is actually in magic. So this idea of sending somebody's attention somewhere so that they cannot attend to something else is something that magicians use all the time. It's the fundamentals of misdirection. So we'll take a look at an example, and let's see if you can detect the misdirection that occurs in this particular example here.
Go there. Okay. You watch it right there. Okay. You know, there's a word, misdirection, that's used by lay people a lot. It's a magical term. It's a term of art. And the way lay people use it is wrong, because lay people often use it as a synonym for distraction. Like, hey, look over there, do something sneaky here, and then you look back and the trick's done. That doesn't fool anyone. Mm-hmm. The way we use the word misdirection is kind of a curating of attention, giving the audience a story they can tell themselves that lets them not really know they were distracted. We're going to do a trick right now using misdirection. I'm going to tell you what it is. The trick is the vanishing chicken. There's a chicken in there, we're going to make it disappear. Now, when I say give you a story to tell yourself, it's not some jive-ass story like this is Clucky McCluckface and this is the chicken coop rocket ship to Mars. No, a real story, which is, you know, it's a vanishing chicken. I've told you that.
Yes.
You know we're Penn and Teller. You know we do magic tricks. So as soon as I cover up this chicken, You're telling yourself what you're going to do. You're telling yourself a story. You're making yourself a promise. Because you're promising yourself right now that at no time will you allow your attention.
Oh my goodness.
This direction. Now, Jimmy, I want to see how well this works. We have the house lights up. I can see people. Yeah, just want to see. Show of hands. How many of you saw the gorilla with the symbols? Should be everyone. It's a goddamn gorilla with symbols. Should be all of you. Now, subset of that. How many of you saw Teller walk out here, cop the chicken, and split? That's almost everyone too. Now, here's where the misdirection comes in. How many of you, during all of that, saw sneak the gorilla into the cage? I never saw that because that's misdirection. Oh my God. That's Are
you kidding me? Oh my God. That is totally.
All right, so I didn't see them sneak the gorilla in. But again, this is all, again, due to the fact that it takes your attention time to go from place to place. So I don't know how they did this trick. If I did, I'd probably have a show in Vegas as well. But the key here is again, these little things that we do in the Cog Labs, these processes that we're talking about, they have real world important applications, such as driving, such as, magical entertainment, such as just everything that we do in our lives. So keep that in mind as we go through, because sometimes when we do the Cog Labs and we're like, ooh, look at this 100 millisecond difference here, it can get a little bit stale, but always try to think about, well, what does this mean for the real world? What does change detection mean for the real world? And that will help kind of ground these effects much more solidly in your life. Any final comments or questions before we wrap this up?
The neutral line. You talked about the arrows being endogenous or exogenous. The neutral line.
So the question is, the neutral line, is it endogenous or is it exogenous? In this case, I would say it's neither, because the neutral line doesn't have a goal. It doesn't send you one place or the other, but at the same time, it doesn't grab your attention either. So the driving force in the neutral condition, when you find that red square, that would be exogenous. When the red square pops up, that's an exogenous grabbing of your attention. But the line itself doesn't carry any sort of stimulus that grabs your attention, and it also doesn't have a goal attached to it. Any other questions? All right, that's it. So if you didn't get a chance to sign in on the sign-in sheet, find it, bring it up to the front here. And next class, we're going to start perception. So keep up to date with your readings and things. And then in a week, we're going to have our first exam.